Banjo Ben here with banjobenclark.com. Let me give you a little heads up with what you're about to hear so that you can be listening for it. This is really fun. A few weeks ago, I did the same lesson for guitar. It's called Pushin licks, and people were like, please do that for banjo. And I was like, absolutely. This is a great lesson. So here's the point of the lesson. The point of the lesson is I want us to see that licks that are called G licks and licks that are called C licks and D licks aren't just meant for those chords. You can actually play those licks over other chords too. So I've got a chord progression for you that I'm going to play through 3 times, okay? And it's a 16-bar chord progression. It just goes G, C, D, back to G, and then it repeats. And I'm going to play some pretty salty licks over those, and I'll tell you why later on. But then the next time that we go through it, the second time, I'm going to scoot the licks back 1 measure, so that I start playing C licks 1 measure before the rhythm section gets to C. And the same for D. Then the third time when we go through it, I'm going to scoot them back even further, so that now my lead playing is 2 measures in front of what the rhythm, and I want you to, what the rhythm plays. And what I want you to listen for is that it sounds okay, that it actually has a really cool grit to it and resolution that you're going to want to use in your own playing. Check it out, and then we'll talk again afterward. Did you hear what we did there? If you didn't, I'll make it clear for you by the time we get to the lesson. But I love what we're doing here because it's going to free up our playing. You know, so often people will think about a chord progression. They'll think, okay, I've got 2 measures of G. I've got to play a 2-measure G lick, right? Well, actually, you don't. There's all kinds of other licks out there that we can use over a G chord. And the same for the C and the same for the D. We've just got to think a little bit about the theory behind that. That's where we're going to start today. Yes, you're going to learn the licks that I just played if you want to do that. But really, this is a much bigger concept lesson because we're going to start with the theory and talk pentatonic scales for the 1, 4, and 5 and why these licks work over other chords. And then we will get into the concept of pushing ahead on our licks and why they work and when we might be able to do that. If you're watching somewhere else beside the website, come on over, banjobenclark.com. This is about a 30-minute lesson. We're going to have a good time. I've got the tabs for lots of stuff and also the MP3 jam track so you can practice along with me. Let's go. Let's talk theory for just a little bit, and then we'll get into those licks. Let's also talk approach, because as I began to play around better and better players, as I was getting into the music scene, one thing I noticed is that the players that were better players moved away from more of a lick mindset and got more into a phrase mindset. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. One of my favorite guitar players, a good friend of mine, Mr. Kenny Smith, he's got a website, by the way, Kenny Smith Guitar, where you can go and learn. I heard him actually talk about this one time when he was teaching, and he said, you know, he's always thinking about where's the song going. So if you got 4 measures of G, and you know that after that you're going to go to C, instead of thinking, now I've got to come up with 4 1-measure G licks and then make sure that I land on a C lick whenever the band goes to C, he's thinking, I'm going to C, I'm just going to start heading there, and I'm going to start borrowing notes from the C scale and the C pentatonic scale that's going to start cluing folks around me into where we're going. And it's really boils down to musicality, because this is what mature musicians do. They begin telling a story instead of just throwing out a bunch of Lego blocks that have very rigid corners and sides. We begin painting and literally giving hints and clues to where we're going. And what I want you to see, today we're working the key of G, but it doesn't matter what key you're in. What I want you to see is that most of the chords that we're going to go to in the key of G have so much in common with that home G chord that you can begin to borrow from those scales before you ever even get there. And it's going to cause your playing to sound much more, I think, mature and much more tasty. Let me show you the theory behind that so you can see what I'm talking about. Now, when you think about the key of G, most of the song is going to be based off the G major scale. Okay, but then inside of that, there's something that we call a pentatonic scale. I'm not going to get into the full history of that or significance of that here. There's lots on my site. You can learn about that or look online. But the pentatonic scale is really interesting because the pentatonic scale is just a 5-note scale that's deduced from the major scale, which is a 7-note scale. And it's just made up of some notes that are what I would call safe notes. So if we take the G major pentatonic scale, which sounds like this, those 5 notes, and we build licks out of that, those licks are going to sound good almost no matter what chord you're over in a typical G major chord progression. One of the licks that's built out of the G major pentatonic scale is this. Okay, we all know or have heard that lick. That's built out of our major pentatonic scale with a little slide thrown in there. So what I want you to do now is just visually see something that's going on with that pentatonic scale and the chords that we most often go to in the key of G. Check out this first line tab here. The first 3 measures are the G major scale. I'm going to start down on the low D note instead of the root, just so you can see the full first position. Okay, so the root is right here. And whenever we look at the G pentatonic scale, that's in measure 4. So I just want you to compare the tab of the major scale with the G pentatonic and see what's there and what's missing. The pentatonic sounds like this. Okay, so we're leaving out a few notes. We're leaving out that 4th frets. We're also leaving out the 1st frets, okay? Now, here's what's very, very interesting. In the key of G, you most often go to the C and the D chord. That's the 4 and the 5. And in Western music, that's just very common, 1, 4, and 5. Other chords we go to, but those are the most common. Let us compare something with those chords. Look at the second line of tab. The first 3 measures are the exact same. I have the G major scale. But in measure 8 now, we have the C pentatonic scale. The C pentatonic, and check it out, sounds like this. Do you notice anything in common between the G major scale and the C pentatonic? Well, one thing that I hope that you might notice, especially after I point out, is that there is not a single note in the C pentatonic scale that's not in the G major scale. Let me say that again. There's not a single note in the C pentatonic scale that's not in the G major scale. Now, why would that be significant? Well, because if we play licks that are based out of the C pentatonic scale, we're wallering all in a G major scale. That's just kind of the most blue-collar, street-level way that I can say that. You're safe. You're safe playing out of a C pentatonic scale over a G chord. You're not going to do anything wrong. And so many of our C licks are built out of that. Gosh, we see all this common ground that can all of a sudden take place. Here's what I also know, that over a C chord, there's a whole lot of my G major scale that's going to work there. That's good to know. Well, let's keep going. Look at the next line. We have our G major scale again. And then I've got our D pentatonic. Compare the D pentatonic, measure 12, to what we see with the G major scale. What do you see? The same thing. Okay, so there's the D pentatonic, and there's not a single note in the D pentatonic scale that isn't in the G major scale. What does that mean? That we're sharing a lot of the same real estate between G and D. Okay, so what this should begin to tell us is that our D licks that we know and our C licks that we know are not strictly C and D licks. They're going to work over a G chord. And in fact, the C and the D licks may work over their own chords too. C may work for D, D may work for C. Let's look at the next line tab, and we see all 3 pentatonic scales lined up there, one right after the other. I just want you to take a moment and look at what all they have in common. Look how many of the same frets we're playing. G pentatonic, C pentatonic, D pentatonic. Okay, so I want us to break down the segmentation in our minds that might be there whenever you're thinking, oh gosh, I have two measures of C, I've got to come up with a C lick. Not necessarily. And especially not if your song is continuing to change chords, because we're in it to tell a story. And we can begin borrowing from those chords that are coming. And we begin borrowing from other licks to begin letting our audience, letting our listeners know that there's something going on here and that I'm taking them on an adventure. And that's what I want to show you how to do. Let's check out the licks here. We'll see what it sounds like and what it feels like to do that. If you're watching somewhere else besides banjobenclark.com, you can come over to the site, see this full 30-minute lesson, download all the tabs and the MP3 jam tracks. If you're already watching here on the site, as a Gold Peak member, just scroll down, click on the next video segment.